Hello, in this video I want to continue the series we've been doing so far about Derrida. I've been really interested in this particular series because I think there's a lot of really interesting ways that Derrida interacts with the resolution that's about to be happening, and so I think that a lot of the conversation that we'll be having, especially as we transition to this last set of 4 videos or so talking about Derrida, I think can be critically kind of important for how we just generally think about some of the ideas for what generally Derrida does when it comes into contact with the water resolution, how it changes some of the central question of the debate. If you haven't, make sure to check out some of the other videos that I've done talking about Derrida, the intro to Derrida, and some of the other videos that I've done just going over some of the basic ideas from a lot of his writing. I think can be really, really helpful in terms of that it can be really helpful in terms of helping you develop the argument as a whole or be able to answer the argument. And I think just building knowledge about what you should do when you see Derrida's name pop up in other people's arguments and stuff, or when you see it pop up in evidence that you're cutting, how you should be thinking about the role that it plays in debate, I think is incredibly important. For this particular set of videos, I want to talk a little bit about Derrida on the affirmative and start talking about what I think about maybe the strengths and weaknesses of it as an argument, and also the ways in which I think it can help you create a really interesting, I think, linkage to the resolution, while also allowing you to kind of create a way of thinking about the presence of things like hauntology and how we think about the way in which resolutions kind of form themselves. And I think that the kind of particular usage of the water resolution can be a really interesting place to bring in forefront a lot of the arguments that Derrida makes, and I think have a really easy argument that has a key that has a really easy internal link to the resolution, and that I think can allow you to really ask critical questions that I think are already really being written about in the context of water and Derrida. In terms of just what I think the ideal version of what this alpha looks like, or what I think the strengths and weaknesses are, I think most of the apps that you'll see kind of referencing Derrida on this resolution will be mostly related to the idea of ontology and it as a method. I think there are a lot of literature bases from pessimism or from anti-blackness or from black studies or from settler colonialism and from studies of NATO genocide, and also the ways in which we just think about capitalism and the increase of neoliberalism and the privatization of water. I think all have a relationship and are kind of what haunts a lot of what the topic will kind of hold. I think a lot of the conversations that you've seen on previous resolutions where people have talked about the climate and talked about things like the Zong, etc., are places where hauntology shows up a lot, because there are so many authors that are writing about the way in which historical legacies of violence trace into the very ways that we have access to natural resources that are really necessary, that I think that there's a really interesting way in order for you to kind of frame some of these questions and be able to attend to various marginalized communities and the way in which they relate to the haunting or the specters of the resolution. And I think that even if you're not going for the idea that they're the only specters that haunt the res, then I think there are a lot of reasons why being able to talk through the way in which the past kind of creates the present of foundation for how we think about water in general is really, really important. I think that a place where I think I see a lot of these affirmatives struggle, and where I think that I think a lot of these affirmatives need a lot more work, is trying to figure out how to win the relationship between the way in which hauntology presents itself as a way of thinking through the possibilities of how we interpret the resolution and debate as a space, but also thinking about the way in which hauntology transitions into something beyond the institution of debate, beyond the academy, without getting sucked up into a lot of the other criticisms. And I think that a lot of the other kind of arguments that we've talked about in terms of Derrida's relationship to ideas about the academy, how do we do hauntology without contributing to the total knowledge of the academy, etc., I think are really important ways to consider how you kind of want to build this affirmative and where you want to be spending time in order to make this stuff incredibly strategic, and to make it so that I think it's really popping out in the most strategic ways, and that the places where you're putting a lot of explanation are really helping you in the long run against various other types of arguments. I think that when you're trying to figure out just how you should be kind of debating this out on the case debate and how you should be kind of extending this as a case argument, I think that you should generally be framing hauntology as a way for us to understand how we should grapple with the way in which the past kind of presents and creates the conditions for the types of choices that we make in the present and in the future. And although it may not determine every factor for how we are able to move towards the future, it is incredibly important to consider in order to have a relevant understanding of the way in which tactics trace across history. And I think that making the importance of how maybe not movements themselves, but how the ways in which movements take up arms and revolutionary action is taken from the ability to understand how they're kind of haunted by the violence of the U.S. and the way in which the evolution of various forms of structural violence have taken place. I think can be a really good place for you to set the stage of how you want the type of epistemological frame that you're using to fit into how the judge is thinking about the possibility of outside action. Because I think that as for you kind of go down the case debate, I think a lot of the times that the types of arguments that people are going to read to you are just going to be about why hauntology as an affective strategy doesn't really do anything, or why the idea of just like remembering gifts doesn't necessarily create a one-to-one relationship to our ability to like make better decisions. But I do think that if you're able to push this in the context of how people have like taken tactics from each other historically in a way that like has created a more kind of like generative community of like how people think about politics, etc., I think then you have like a much better way to explain this, not as just an affective response to the way in which like violence happens, but rather as one that like uses the collective cultural memory that is experienced as like trauma within communities that people kind of face on an everyday basis, and that kind of inflict various forms of like violence in various ways. I think can really help you like bridge a lot of the gaps, because I think what people bridge a lot of gaps between what people think when they see the word ontology and just kind of like are experiencing it on face value, versus I think maybe a deeper explanation like what it could do to actually take that to the next level when you're thinking about how you want to answer other portions of the flow. I think that when you're trying to consider maybe how you want to answer like a framework T type of argument with ontology, I think that this is really interesting, because I think that debate has such a rich history about the debate about debate itself, that I think that there are so many good reasons why you could talk about the way in which like framework has been used historically is like incredibly important to think about how it's been used now. For people that are watching this and have like very little context, I think that there's a lot of really interesting history to talk about in the way in which like framework as a tool has been used in order to create like modes of like policing or bracketing out like who can and cannot have a voice within debate within the debate community, and like how that operates in order to create like certain ideas about like what creates a good and bad speaker, and who can kind of access like that kind of like desirability in and of itself. And I think that explaining that in the context of how that developed along framework and T historically allows you to make the debate a little bit more expansive than just like the question of the framework that's being read itself and the particular interpretation that's being read by the negative, and really talk about like the form of presentation of framework as a strategy and why it can't be disconnected from like its historical legacy. And I think doing so allows you to not only hold the negative to like a lot more baggage that you can kind of critique them off the basis of in terms of how framework is kind of like deployed as like a tool of violence, but also I think it allows you to really think critically about the ways in which you can like push out these kind of like procedural understandings by explaining them as a way that like the things like framework and T as policing tools have constantly securitized themselves through the ability to kind of like use these neutral values as a way to like make us invest in the ability of a more sustainable like interpretation of the resolution that is created around like forms of thinking about policy and political action that are like only comfortable for certain communities. And I think doing that can really allow you to change the way in which the judge is really thinking about some of the more procedural portion of the debate, which I think is integral to really get the ontology stuff weighed out, and it's really helpful for how you want to establish a lot of your offense on that particular type of the flow. But hopefully this video is helpful for you, and you'll tune into the rest of the videos I'm going to do talking about the way in which I think Derrida can be executed on the affirmative and the way that it can be answered, because I really enjoy doing it. Thanks.